The first thing I noticed was the silence. On a cruise ship carrying over 3,000 passengers and 2,500 crew members, silence is never a good sign. I stood in the middle of the Lido deck, where just hours ago families had been splashing in the pool and music had been blaring from the speakers. Now, there was nothing but the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant hum of engines. As I turned in a slow circle, taking in the abandoned lounge chairs and half-empty cocktails, a chill ran down my spine. Where was everyone? And why did the air suddenly feel so different? My name is Mia Chen, and what should have been a relaxing Caribbean cruise turned into the most bewildering and terrifying experience of my life. I'm still not sure I believe what happened to me, but I know one thing for certain. Time isn't as linear as we think it is, and sometimes the fabric of reality can slip in ways we can't begin to understand. It had started as a typical day at sea. I'd woken up late, nursed a slight hangover from the previous night's karaoke party with a greasy breakfast, and spent the morning lounging by the pool with my latest beach read. Around noon, I'd decided to head back to my cabin for a quick nap before the afternoon's activities. I remember closing my eyes, the gentle rocking of the ship lulling me to sleep. When I woke up, the light filtering through my porthole window seemed off, dimmer somehow, with a strange bluish quality I'd never seen before. Disoriented, I checked my phone. The screen was black, completely dead despite having been fully charged when I lay down. Frowning, I got up and tried the cabin's phone. Nothing but a faint buzzing on the line. That's when I noticed the silence. No distant laughter from the hallway. No muffled announcements over the PA system. Just nothing. A knot of unease forming in my stomach, I stepped out into the hallway. It was deserted. The usual bustle of passengers and crew members conspicuously absent. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the carpeted floor as I made my way towards the elevator bank. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and lost in the empty corridor. No response. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed wildly out of place in the eerie silence. As I rode up to the Lido deck, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe there was some sort of emergency drill I'd slept through. But no. They always announce those well in advance, and surely someone would have woken me. When the elevator doors opened onto the Lido deck, the full extent of the strangeness hit me. The massive open-air deck was completely deserted. Lounge chairs sat empty, some with towels and books still draped over them, as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. The bars were unmanned, rows of colorful cocktails abandoned on their counters. I walked slowly around the deck, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" Only the sound of the waves answered me. As I completed my circuit of the deck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The lifeboats were all still in place. If there had been some kind of emergency evacuation, surely they would have been launched. I spent the next few hours searching the ship, deck by deck, my panic growing with each empty room and deserted corridor I encountered. The theater, mid-setup for the evening's show. The casino, slot machines blinking silently in the dim light. The main dining room, tables set for a dinner that would never be served. Everywhere I looked, I found signs of life interrupted. Half-eaten meals in the buffet, a load of laundry tumbling endlessly in a dryer in the otherwise empty laundromat, a child-stuffed animal dropped in the middle of a hallway. But of the thousands of people who should have been on board, I found no trace. As night fell, or what I assumed was night, given the deepening of that strange bluish light, I made my way to the bridge, hoping against hope to find someone, anyone who could explain what was happening. The bridge was as deserted as the rest of the ship, but at least here there were signs of life. Radar screens blinked, showing our position in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. Navigation systems hummed softly. The ship was still on course, its automated systems continuing their work, even in the absence of human oversight. I slumped into the captain's chair, exhaustion and fear finally overtaking me. What had happened? Where was everyone? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? As I sat there, staring blankly at the array of instruments before me, something caught my eye. The date display on one of the monitors. I blinked. Sure, I must be seeing things. But no. There it was in glowing green letters. August 13th, 2024. A week. Somehow, impossibly, a week had passed since I'd laid down for my nap. I laughed then, a high, hysterical sound that echoed weirdly in the empty bridge. This couldn't be happening. People didn't just lose a week of time. Entire ships full of people didn't just vanish. And yet here I was. The next few days, if they were indeed days, as time seemed to have lost all meaning, passed in a blur. I roamed the ship, leaving notes in every public space, begging for a response, for some sign that I wasn't alone. I tried every phone, every radio, every possible means of communication, but was met with nothing but static. I ate from the slowly rotting supplies in the ship's massive kitchens, slept fitfully in a different cabin each night, and tried to keep myself sane by talking out loud, narrating my actions as if I was the protagonist in some bizarre reality show. On what I think was the fourth day of my solitude, I saw the lights. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, my mind finally cracking under the strain of isolation. But no, there they were. Distant pinpricks of light on the horizon, growing larger by the minute. Hope surged through me. Another ship, a rescue party. I raced to the bow, waving my arms and shouting, even though I knew they were still too far away to see or hear me. As the lights grew closer, I realized with a start that they weren't coming from the sea, but from the sky. My elation turned to confusion, then to a kind of numb acceptance. Of course. Why not? After everything else, why shouldn't there be strange lights in the sky? The lights descended slowly, hovering over the ship. They were beautiful, pulsing with colors I had no names for, casting shimmering reflections on the calm sea. As I watched, a beam of light shot down from the center of the formation, touching the deck just a few feet away from me. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished, and I was no longer alone. The deck was filled with people, passengers in swimsuits and sundresses, crew members in their crisp uniforms. They milled about in confusion, voices rising in a babble of questions and exclamations. What happened? Where did everyone go? Was I dreaming? I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. A man in a captain's uniform strode purposefully towards me, his face a mask of concern. Miss, are you all right? You look pale. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what had happened? In the days that followed, as the ship made its way back to port, a story was pieced together. According to everyone else on board, no time had passed at all. One moment they had been going about their day. The next they had found themselves standing on the deck, disoriented and confused. Only I remembered the empty ship, the days of solitude, the strange lights. Only I had lived through that impossible week. The incident made headlines around the world. Cruise ship reappears after mysterious disappearance. Experts were consulted. Theories were proposed and debunked. Some spoke of wormholes, others of alien abduction. A few fringe voices even suggested a mass hallucination or an elaborate hoax. As for me, I gave my statement to the authorities and then retreated from the public eye. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I describe the profound loneliness of those days on the empty ship? The bone-deep wrongness of a world slightly out of sync? I've never set foot on another cruise ship. The sight of the ocean fills me with a nameless dread. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'm back there, alone on an empty ship, adrift in a sea of time. I don't know what happened on the paradise of the seas. I don't know where everyone went, or why I was left behind, or what those lights in the sky were. But I do know this. Our understanding of reality, of time and space, is far more limited than we think. There are things out there, forces at work, that we can't begin to comprehend. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. a peek behind the curtain of reality, into the vast, terrifying unknown that lies beyond. I got that glimpse, and it changed me forever. So the next time you're on a cruise, or any ship for that matter, and you feel a sudden chill, or notice the quality of light change ever so slightly, or find yourself alone in a place that should be crowded, remember my story, and hope, with every fiber of your being, that you don't slip through the cracks of time like I did. Because trust me, once you've experienced that kind of impossible solitude, you're never quite the same again.
What I'm about to tell you is something I still think about often, especially during this time of year. This happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago. I was driving to my parents' house to celebrate the new year with them. They live a few hours away in upstate Pennsylvania, so I'd left in the late afternoon, figuring I'd get there with plenty of time to spare. The drive was supposed to be simple. I'm the type who really enjoys long drives, so a nice, peaceful drive would give me some much-needed time to think. But the weather had other plans. The snow started falling about an hour into my drive. At first it was light, just flurries dusting the windshield. Nothing to worry about. I thought the snowfall was actually quite pretty, but I'm pretty sure I jinxed myself. The further I drove, the harder the snow came down. It just kept falling and falling until I was literally in the middle of an honest-to-God blizzard. The highway turned slick and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car, a little sedan, isn't exactly great in snow, so when the tires started slipping on even the smallest hills, I knew I had to pull over. There was no point in risking my life. It was my own fault for not planning out the drive better. I found a spot on the shoulder, far enough off the road to avoid passing cars, not that there were many. I texted my parents about my situation, and they seemed worried sick. I tried to reassure them that everything would be okay, but I honestly wasn't too sure about that myself. I figured I'd wait out the worst of the storm, hoping it would just ease up. But the snow didn't let up. In fact, it only seemed to get worse from that point. It just kept coming, piling up around the car and on the road ahead. After an hour or so, it became clear I wasn't going anywhere that night. My dad offered to try and get out to me, but I told him that was a death wish. I told him that if the snow didn't let up, I'd call the police, which he begrudgingly accepted as a decent solution. I really didn't want to call the police, and I didn't have AAA either, so that wasn't an option. I told myself the storm would have to let up eventually, and I decided that if it didn't by the time I got tired, I'd call the police. The thought of spending the night in the car made me uneasy. I didn't want to run out of gas trying to keep warm, and I was worried about killing the battery if I kept the lights or heat on too long. I sat there, turning the engine on and off every so often, trying to conserve what I could. The wind howled outside. I was starting to feel the weight of the isolation when I looked at my rear view and saw headlights cutting through the storm from behind me. I literally wanted to jump for joy. A snowplow pulled up beside me. I was saved. I rolled down the window as the driver leaned out of his. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s. He looked nice. He was wearing a thick jacket and had a black knit hat that was pulled down over his ears. I remember thinking his face was really wrinkly, if that makes sense. It looked weathered, like he had spent decades in harsh conditions. I expected him to say something, but he just stared at me for what seemed like an unusual amount of time. Eventually, he spoke, asking me if I was okay. He had a really gruff voice, definitely a smoker, and it was honestly kind of off-putting. I told him that I didn't think my car could handle the conditions, trying to be friendly but also keep my voice steady. He nodded, saying that I wouldn't get far in a storm like this, especially with the car I had. He paused for a few moments, as if he were considering what to say. I watched his eyes scan my back seat, like he was looking for something. I was just about to respond when he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. I didn't know him, and yeah, he seemed a little strange, but he struck me as a genuine guy. Plus, staying put with my car all night would have been stupid. I asked him if he could drive me to where I was going, and he said it would be no problem. I then asked him what I should do about my car, to which he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Leave it." After a moment, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. At first, the warmth was comforting. I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease as I settled into the seat. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him about my parents' house. I gave him directions, and he nodded again, but didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't awkward, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable. That's when I noticed something odd. He wasn't driving in the direction of my parents' house. I knew because the navigation was literally pointing in the opposite direction. I mean, we were on a local highway. There were only 2 ways to go. I tried my best to sound calm and asked him if we were going the right way in the most normal tone I could muster. I don't think I did a good job, though, because I could feel his demeanor slightly change with my question. Without looking at me, he told me we were taking a short detour and that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. We drove a little longer, and he did in fact get off the highway and start driving along some back road. At least the GPS said we were heading in the right direction. So I thought I was just being paranoid. Something in my gut was still telling me he was off, though, so I started looking around the cab more closely. There were red flags everywhere. Empty liquor bottles rolled on the floor near his feet. There were torn up maps stuffed into the side pockets, and I caught a glimpse of a knife wedged between the seats. I felt my heart start pounding. You know that feeling where your heart just starts beating like crazy and you're worried other people can hear it? That's what was happening to me. By that time, I was also positive we weren't going the right way. The GPS kept recalibrating because he missed turn after turn, not even looking at it. I was panicking. As we continued driving, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the only one I'd seen for miles. I had to act. It felt like a lifeline. I waited until we got closer, took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and then kicked the door open as hard as I could. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I slammed into the ground and felt my leg flare up with pain. I didn't care, though. I got to my feet and started running toward the house. The man shouted something at me, and I glanced back to see him fumbling for something in the glove box, probably going for a gun for all I knew. I didn't look back again. I sprinted through the snow, trying not to slip until I reached the house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A man and woman opened it, and they basically pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. I told them what had just happened, and they didn't ask questions. They just called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out and search the area, but in that storm, finding him was unlikely. They offered to give me a ride to my parents' house, and even helped me call someone to tow my car. I was beyond grateful. My dad was furious once he found out, and I haven't driven in the snow since. I always think about what might have happened had I not jumped out of the car when I did.
One morning, a few months ago during the summer, I decided to check out the yard sale down the street. Yard sales have always really interested me because you never know what kinds of treasures you might stumble across. And that morning, there was a nice crowd already picking through the tables as I walked up. Then I spotted an old lawn chair that looked just like the one my grandma used to have, so I made my way over to take a closer look. As I was giving the chair that closer look, I heard raised voices not too far away. It was coming from a lady who was standing by a table full of dishes and kitchen gadgets. She wasn't yelling or anything, but you could tell that there was some kind of disagreement happening. The lady was arguing with an older man who looked to be in his late 60s over a set of china plates that were all nicely arranged in a cardboard box, probably hoping to sell as a set. The woman was pointing at the plates and saying something I couldn't quite make out. Neither of them were hosting the sale either. Both were people from the neighborhood who'd come looking for a deal. I didn't think much of it at first, because as surprising as it sounds, some people can get pretty heated at yard sales. It's like they forget that they're just trying to get rid of junk that they don't need anymore, and some people take it very personally if you imply that something isn't as valuable as they think it is. And then occasionally, you get two potential buyers arguing over an item they both want, which appeared to be what was happening here. At first, it was just the lady getting very confrontational. But then the older man started raising his voice too, and the whole scene got more intense. He was pointing back at her, and they were exchanging words I couldn't really understand because they were both talking over each other about a mile a minute. I was still looking at that chair at first, not looking, but listening in. But then, by the time they started actually yelling at each other, my curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't help but glance over at the argument. Other people were turning to look too. One guy even set down the book that he was flipping through to see what was going on. Then the next thing, the host of the yard sale is walking over saying something like, Hey, take it easy. But then, before the guy can even get over there, the lady grabs one of the plates and raises it up above her head. I thought for sure that she was about to smash that plate or something, like a sort of, if I can't have it, no one can kind of deal. But the second she did, the older man lunges toward her, and because he's a little taller than her, grabs the plate with ease, but then starts trying to wrestle it out of her grip. The lady has one hand on the plate, another on her purse, but then the older guy puts two hands on the plate, and then sort of turns his body as he's pulling it out of her hands. He succeeds in pulling it out of her grip, but as he does, he loses his balance and falls. He hit the ground, and we heard the plate smash, and then the guy let out this very long and painful grunt, and just from the way it sounded, I knew that it was probably bad. And everyone seemed stunned. They all heard the same thing I did, and they must have known that something was bad too. But there was just this moment where no one moved and no one said anything, almost like we were hoping that things wouldn't be as bad as they looked. The woman froze, staring down at the man who lay on his front, not moving, and seconds later, we saw this blood start to ooze from underneath him, and the woman started screaming. People rushed to the older guy's aid, telling him not to move and yelling for someone to call 911. But the lady that had been in the scuffle with him just stood there, completely in shock, saying, oh my God, over and over. The folks that rushed over to help rolled the guy over so they could try and stop the bleeding, but that's when everyone saw the big shard of porcelain sticking out of the guy's stomach. The lady who had been in the scuffle started to cry as we did everything we could to stop the bleeding, and the man just sort of laid there, breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. Thankfully, the paramedics arrived fast, closely followed by the cops. Then, after the ambulance took the older guy off, the cops started taking statements from us. I didn't have much to say. I was just there to buy a lawn chair, not get involved in a yard sale showdown that ended up in someone dying. And the lady involved in the scuffle just cried and cried. And I don't think it was entirely her fault that the guy had fallen. Like it was all just a horrible accident, I suppose. But at the time, she clearly blamed herself for what had happened, and some people in the crowd did too. I think the cops then drove her home to talk to her more at her house. And later, as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the image of that man lying on the ground. It was the way that he was staring up at the sky, very wide-eyed and scared, more scared than I'd ever seen anyone in my whole life, and I can't imagine what must have been going through his head. And neither can I imagine what was going through the lady's head when she found out that the guy had actually passed. I found out from my neighbor the next day, and when I told him I was actually there, he asked me what had happened. And I told him that they were both being just childish, fighting over a piece of porcelain. And my neighbor then asked if the lady pushed the guy, and I said no, that he fell because he was sort of wrenching the plate away from the lady so hard that he spun around when it left her hands. I said that it seemed like the lady started it, but then again, I only heard her voice first, you know. The older man could have easily said something under his breath, and that's what started the whole thing. The whole thing felt like equal blame on each side, but in the end, it was a life lost and a life ruined. Really, neither of them deserved that. I guess once they got the full story, the older guy's family didn't press any charges, but the lady still left town not long after, I'm pretty sure. Even though it was all but publicly declared that she wasn't to blame, people still said that she killed that guy. It was like they wanted it to be her fault, just so they had someone to blame. And they didn't exactly go driving her out of town afterwards, but I guess all their stares and hushed words got too much for her, and she eventually moved on of her own accord. To me, it's just crazy how something as simple as an argument in a yard sale can end up in such tragedy. One second it's a nice day, people were out taking walks, and then the next, a dude's dead.
The first thing I noticed when I stepped out onto the porch that morning was the silence. No birdsong, no distant lowing of cattle, not even the rustle of wind through the cornfields. Just an eerie, oppressive quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I saw it, a vast, intricate pattern carved into my wheat field, the stalks bent and woven with impossible precision. In that moment, as the rising sun cast long shadows across the design, I knew my life would never be the same. What I didn't know was how deep the rabbit hole went, or how dangerous the truth would turn out to be. My name's Jack Harper, and I've been farming this land for over 30 years. It's been in my family for generations, passed down from father to son since my great-grandfather first broke ground here in the 1890s. I've seen droughts, floods, and everything in between, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that summer. It started innocently enough. A few of my cows got spooked one night, breaking through a fence and stampeding across the north pasture. Unusual, but not unheard of. Then my tractor started acting up, the electronics going haywire for no apparent reason. Again, annoying, but nothing too out of the ordinary for aging farm equipment. But then came the lights. I first saw them about a week before the crop circle appeared. I was up late, going over some paperwork in the kitchen, when a flash of light outside caught my eye. At first, I thought it was headlights from a passing car, but we're pretty isolated out here. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles down the road. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw them. 3 bright orbs of light, hovering silently over my wheat field. They pulsed with an otherworldly glow, casting long shadows across the swaying stalks. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights shot straight up into the sky and vanished. I told myself I was tired, that maybe I'd dozed off at the kitchen table and dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next few nights, I stayed up watching, but the lights didn't return. Just as I was starting to think I'd imagined it all, I woke up to find the crop circle. It was massive, covering nearly half of my 100-acre wheat field. The design was incredibly complex, a series of interlocking circles and crescents that seemed to spiral out from a central point. The wheat stalks were bent, not broken, woven together in a way that defied explanation. I called the sheriff, more out of a sense of obligation than any real hope for answers. Bob's been a friend for years, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes as he surveyed the damage. It could be pranksters, he suggested, not sounding very convinced. You know how kids get in the summer looking for thrills. I shook my head. Bob, this would have taken a team of people all night to do, and they'd have left tracks. Look at the ground. There's not a single footprint or tire track anywhere. He didn't have an answer for that. Word spread quickly, as it tends to do in small towns. By noon, my driveway was clogged with curiosity seekers, amateur paranormal investigators, and local news crews. I did my best to keep them off my property, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. That's when things started to get really strange. It began with the animals. My dogs, usually friendly to a fault, became aggressive, snarling at anyone who came near the crop circle. The cattle refused to graze anywhere near that field, clustering at the far end of their pasture and bellowing uneasily through the night. Then the equipment failures escalated. Not just my tractor now, but every piece of electronic equipment on the farm. Cell phones died within minutes of being fully charged. The TV emitted nothing but static, occasionally interrupted by bursts of what sounded like voices speaking in an unknown language. And the dreams. God, the dreams. Every night, I found myself wandering through that wheat field, the stalks whisper singing around me in voices just on the edge of comprehension. Something was always just ahead of me, always just out of sight. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling that I was on the verge of understanding something vast and terrible. About a week after the crop circle appeared, I had a visitor. He introduced himself as Dr. Alan Friedman, an astrophysicist from the State University. He was different from the other investigators who'd come sniffing around. quieter, more serious. "Mr. Harper," he said, his eyes never leaving the crop circle. "Have you noticed any other unusual phenomena since this appeared? Lights in the sky, perhaps? Electronic disturbances?" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "How did you know about that?" He turned to me then, his expression grave. "Because this isn't the first time this has happened. There's a pattern, Mr. Harper. These events, they're escalating." Over the next few hours, Dr. Friedman told me things that shook me to my core, about other crop circles, all following a similar design, appearing across the country over the past few years, about increased UFO sightings in those areas, and about people who had gone missing, always in the weeks following the appearance of a circle. "We believe," he said in a low voice, "that these are some kind of test sites, that whatever intelligence is behind this is preparing for something bigger." I wanted to dismiss it all as crazy talk, but I couldn't, not after what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. "What do they want?" I asked, my mouth dry. Dr. Friedman shook his head. "We don't know, but we think you might be in danger, Mr. Harper. These sites, they seem to have a strange effect on the people closest to them. We've documented cases of unusual behavior, of people claiming to receive messages or orders from some unknown source." As he spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought of my dreams, of the whispers just on the edge of understanding. "What should I do?" I asked. "Let us set up some monitoring equipment," he said. "And whatever you do, don't enter that field. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, promise me." I promised, but promises, I would soon learn, are hard to keep when reality itself seems to be unraveling around you. The next few days were a blur of activity. Dr. Friedman and his team set up cameras and sensors around the perimeter of the crop circle. They took samples of the soil and the wheat, muttering to each other in low, worried tones. And all the while, the whispers in my dreams grew louder, more insistent. I'd wake up with strange symbols etched in my mind, my fingers itching to draw them. The urge to walk into that field, to reach the center of the circle, became almost overwhelming. It all came to a head on the 7th night after the circle appeared. I was jolted awake by a sound I'd never heard before, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled to the window and felt my heart stop. The crop circle was glowing, pulsing with a soft, blue-white light that seemed to beat in time with the thrumming sound. And there, hovering above it, were the lights I'd seen before. But this time, they were descending. I don't remember deciding to go outside. One moment I was at the window, the next I was running across the yard in my pajamas, drawn toward the circle by a force I couldn't resist. Dr. Friedman's warning echoed in my head, but it seemed distant, unimportant. All that mattered was reaching the center of the circle, meeting whatever was coming down from the sky. I was at the edge of the wheat field when a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back. It was Dr. Friedman, his face pale in the otherworldly light. "Harper, no!" he shouted over the thrumming. "If you go in there, we'll lose you." I struggled against his grip, the whispers in my head drowning out everything else, but he held firm, and slowly, painfully, I felt the compulsion begin to fade. We watched, transfixed, as the lights descended into the center of the crop circle. There was a flash so bright it left spots dancing in my vision, and then nothing. The lights were gone. The thrumming stopped. The crop circle lay dark and still. In the days that followed, government agents swarmed my farm. The crop circle was dug up. Every grain of soil tested and retested. I was questioned for hours, as were Dr. Friedman and his team. They found nothing, no radiation, no unexplained elements, nothing to prove that anything out of the ordinary had happened. The official story became that it was an elaborate hoax, despite the lack of any evidence to support that theory. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. It's been 5 years since that night. I still farm the land, but things are different now. The wheat doesn't grow in that field anymore, no matter what we plant. On quiet nights, I sometimes think I can still hear those whispers on the edge of my mind. And sometimes, when I look up at the stars, I can't shake the feeling that something up there is looking back, watching, waiting. I don't know what would have happened if I'd made it to the center of that circle. I don't know what's coming or when, but I do know this. We are not alone, and the universe is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. So if you ever find a strange pattern carved into your fields, or see lights in the sky that move like nothing you've ever seen before, remember my story, and whatever you do, don't answer when they call, because once you do, there's no going back.
I've never been one for parties, even in college. I got sick of the whole going out culture pretty quickly, and I found that I always had more fun doing something meaningful with a few close friends. I'm from a rural area, northwestern Ontario. This happened a couple years ago. Ever since I was a kid, my dad and his buddies had a New Year's Eve tradition of going ice fishing while everyone else was celebrating the New Year however they celebrated. My mom wasn't really in the picture, and we didn't have much extended family, so I grew up spending New Year's Eve on a frozen lake in the frigid cold with my dad, his brother, my brother, and my dad's friends. My dad isn't around anymore, and my brother moved to Chicago a number of years ago, but I still try and go ice fishing as much as possible, especially as a way to celebrate New Year's Eve. I'm not really sure why. I just feel like I have some kind of obligation to keep the tradition going. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, are pretty rugged guys themselves. You know the type, those burly, lumberjack-looking dudes that seem more in touch with wilderness than society. That's honestly how I describe myself too. Anyway, the three of us tried to keep the tradition alive as best we could, which was great because spending New Year's Eve alone would be depressing as hell. Nate was the one driving that day. His truck was perfect for the job. Big tires, four-wheel drive, and enough room in the back for all of our gear. We'd packed everything we needed. Rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul everything, and a small pop-up shelter to shield us from the worst of the cold. The forecast predicted a clear night, but in Ontario, you never trust the weather reports entirely. We were prepared for anything. At least, we thought we were. The lake we were heading to wasn't a well-known spot, and that's what we loved about it. It was tucked away, surrounded by thick trees with a surface that stayed frozen solid even in the milder parts of winter. It wasn't a place you'd stumble across unless you knew exactly where to look. As Nate navigated the snowy back roads, the excitement started to build. There's something about the quiet stillness of ice fishing. Just you, your friends, and the promise of the catch. Definitely beats drinking beer after beer at some random bar. As we pulled up to park near the trailhead, I noticed someone standing nearby. He was a few yards away, bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our truck. At first, I thought maybe he was just a fellow angler sizing us up, but then I saw him glance down at his phone, then back at us, then back at his phone again. For some reason, it didn't feel casual. I don't really know how to explain it. It just felt off. I muttered to my friends that guy was creeping me out. The two of them looked up. Trevor shrugged his shoulders and Nate nodded but didn't say anything. We were about to start unloading when the man suddenly rushed towards us, waving his arms wildly. I rolled the window down to hear what he was saying. He started screaming that we needed to come help him immediately and that his buddy had just fallen through the ice. He pointed at his phone, saying the other guy they were with just told him. He sounded frantic, and his desperation was definitely real. We didn't even think. Trevor opened his door, and then we were all out, following the man as he took off down the trail toward the lake. We didn't stop to grab anything, not even our coats. The urgency in his voice was enough to override any second thoughts. The man was practically sprinting, and we had to jog to keep up. As we got closer to the lake, I started to notice something that didn't sit right. He wasn't leading us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading toward a more remote part of the shoreline, away from where the ice was thickest. I was about to stop following, but it was too late. They appeared in view before we could do anything. 2 more men standing near the edge of the lake. They weren't dressed for fishing, and they weren't moving. They were just standing there, waiting. I glanced down at their hands. They were both armed. My blood ran cold. One of them yelled at us to stop right there as we approached. He raised his gun and pointed it directly at me. I honestly can't describe the feeling that you get when someone points a gun at you. I hope no one ever has to experience what I felt that day. My heart dropped as the man we'd been following turned to face us, a smirk creeping across his face. We'd been set up. The second guy demanded Nate's keys, along with everything we had on our persons. We didn't really have a choice. These guys didn't seem like they were messing around. Nate reached into his pocket and tossed the truck keys to the man, and the three of us emptied our pockets. I tried to hang on to my phone, but one of the men told me phones too. Nate said his was in the car, which they laughed about. I've never been more furious in my life. How could we have been so foolish? I clenched my fists, wishing those guys weren't armed. I would have taken all of them on. Within moments, they grabbed everything and walked us back up the path at gunpoint before one of the men sped off in Nate's car. The other two backed away into the woods, presumably to their own vehicle. I debated following them, but I figured that wouldn't be much help. We stood there for a moment, shivering, before Nate pulled out his phone. I knew he had lied about it being in the car. I honestly don't know what we would have done had he not thought quickly on his feet. Somehow, we still had service. He called the police, explaining everything as calmly as he could. The dispatcher told us to stay put, and we huddled together for warmth as we waited for help to arrive. I was still so unbelievably angry. Nate was the worst, though. He kept kicking nearby trees and cursing at the top of his lungs. There was nothing Trevor or I could do to calm him down. The whole thing had happened so fast. I was honestly still processing it all. Why the hell would there be people out in the middle of nowhere on New Year's Eve of all days? It didn't make any sense. I'll skip all the boring details. The cops took an official report and were gracious enough to drive us all back to Trevor's house, which was the closest. As you might expect, Nate's car was never located, and those people were never caught. The three of us still can't believe what had happened. Trevor thinks we just stumbled into the wrong people at the wrong time, that they weren't planning on robbing us, but we just so happened to be the perfect targets. I think that's possible, but it still feels so unlikely. Who just springs a trap on some random people in the spur of the moment? But it also wouldn't make sense for them to be waiting for us at such a secluded spot. They had no guarantee anyone would show up. I really have no idea what to make of this whole incident.
It was a typical Saturday morning, filled with the usual errands and a long list of things to do. But the yard sale today's sign caught my eye as it drove past, and before I knew it, I found myself pulling over. It was set up in the front yard of a small, weathered house. Nothing really special, just the typical kind of yard sale that you see around here. But as I walked up, I noticed an old, unlabeled cardboard box sitting on the ground near the back of the table. It was dusty and looked like it hadn't been moved in years, and I crouched down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't very heavy, but it was strangely solid, like there was a lot of stuff inside it. The lid was taped down and the edges were frayed. I asked what was inside, and the middle-aged man running the sale told me, "Just a box of old stuff. Feel free to take a look." I lifted the lid, carefully peeling away the tape, and then peered inside. The contents were a strange mix of items. There were a few old hairbands, a couple of rusted keys, a small hairbrush, and some photographs. But the one thing that stood out were all the newspaper clippings. They were all yellowed with age and crinkled along the edges, and I picked one up and read the headline, and when I did, I sort of felt a chill run down my spine. "Missing person, Jane Doe," it said. There were several clippings, all about the same person, a woman whose body had been found decades ago in a nearby town. I flipped through the articles, reading the details. Her body had been found in the early 90s, and partly because she was never identified, her murder went unsolved. The articles described Jane Doe as a young brunette, last seen visiting a local diner, but as I sifted through the clippings, I discovered more disturbing details. There were photographs tucked in among them, grainy, black and white images of a woman who matched Jane Doe's, walking alone in a parking lot, entering a store, or sitting on a bench. There were also personal items in the box. The hairbrush that I mentioned, a few pieces of jewelry, and some clothing. They were old, worn, and had a very musty smell. The seller was still standing behind the table, not really looking at me, and wasn't really saying a word. I glanced up at him, wondering if he knew anything about this Jane Doe. But he just stood there, silent and very indifferent. It was as if though he was waiting for me to leave so he could go back inside the house. I asked if he knew who the woman was, and he looked at it and just sort of shrugged. He said he found the box in his attic, had never opened it, and had no idea what was inside. But his answer didn't really sit right with me. How could he not care about what was inside that box? It wasn't just old stuff, it was part of someone's life, and it was somehow connected to some terrible unsolved murder. I wanted to press him for more information, but there was something about him that told me he wasn't interested in talking, and so I began reading the newspaper clipping more carefully. There were mentions of a man, Jane's boyfriend at the time that she went missing. He was a local guy, well known in town, but no one had seen him since the day that he disappeared. His name was mentioned in the articles, but there were no photos of him. As I pieced together the story, I began to wonder if the seller knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he was connected to the case somehow. Maybe he was hiding something. Could he have been involved in this Jane's disappearance, or was he telling the truth about just finding it in his home? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than I was seeing. I had to know more, but I didn't know where to start. The newspaper clippings were a dead end. They were decades old, and the people mentioned in them were long gone, so I decided to take the box with me. I paid that seller a few dollars for it and walked back to my car and then drove back home. When I got home, I laid all the clippings on my kitchen table in this sort of jumbled mess of information, and I tried to make sense of it all. But it was sort of like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces, and the whole situation was very unsettling, and every clipping seemed to only raise more questions than they had answered. When my husband eventually arrived home, I showed him what I brought home from the yard sale, and at first he looked at me like I was nuts. But after he read through some of the clippings and took a look at the other more personal items, he started to see what I did. Anyone with photographs of Jane Doe would have surely known her identity, in which case, why didn't they come forward when they learned of her murder? I remember my husband said how, logically speaking, the photos and the clippings might not be connected. Someone might have just put a bunch of stuff in a box, and without once stopping to consider how it might be interpreted when opened by complete strangers. And why the hell would they? But I doubted that very, very much. That seemed like way too much of a coincidence. If there was a bunch of old lottery tickets and a sewing kit in there, then yeah, maybe it was just a junk box. But everything was too personal, too deliberate. It almost felt like a trophy. My husband didn't want to believe it at first, saying I was just overreacting after getting in my own head about it, but I told him I was convinced. That wasn't just some random brunette lady. It was the murdered woman. It was Jane Doe. He didn't tell me when it clicked for him, but when I reached for the box, he almost snapped at me when he said, "Don't touch it." And that's when I knew that he believed it too. He didn't want me to touch anymore because he realized that it might actually be forensic evidence, something which, in my excitement, I hadn't considered at all up until that point. We got in touch with the police the next morning. They came and took the box, and then as far as I know, they went to talk to the guy that had hosted the yard sale about how exactly he'd come to own it. I called one of the officers that we spoke to a while later, and he said that the box and everything in it had been entered into Jane Doe's evidence file, and while I hadn't exactly blown open the case, it was certainly a development in what had been a decades-old unsolved murder. That was just about the only half-decent thing about this whole story. That somehow, and even if it was only a little, I actually helped.
The coffee cup was still warm. That's what got me. Not the eerie silence, not the abandoned cars, not even the fresh tire tracks leading nowhere. It was that paper cup in the trash, steam still rising from its contents, that made my skin crawl. Someone had been here moments ago, But the rest stop was deserted. As I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the woods, a figure watched. And in that moment I knew I'd stumbled into something I shouldn't have seen, something I might not escape from. My name's Alex, and I've been driving cross-country for a living for the better part of a decade. Long-haul trucking isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills and satisfies my wanderlust. I've seen my share of weird stuff on the road, inexplicable lights in the sky, ghost towns that aren't on any map, even what some might call supernatural occurrences. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I encountered that night at the Pinewood rest stop. It was a routine run, St. Louis to Portland with a trailer full of electronics. I'd been pushing hard, trying to make up time after a delay at my last stop. The night was moonless, the highway a ribbon of black stretching endlessly before me. I'd been fighting sleep for the last hour, my eyes gritty and my mind fuzzy. When I saw the sign for the rest stop, I almost cried with relief. Just a quick break, I told myself. Splash some water on my face, grab a coffee, and I'd be good for another few hours. The rest stop appeared out of the darkness like an island of light. It was one of those older ones, with a small building housing restrooms and vending machines, and a separate area for trucks to park. As I pulled in, I noticed a few cars in the lot, but no people visible. I parked and stepped out of my rig, stretching muscles cramped from hours of sitting. The air was unnaturally still, no breeze, no sounds of insects or distant traffic, just silence. That should have been my first warning. I made my way to the building, my footsteps echoing loudly on the concrete. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound jarring in the quiet. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a harsh glare over the empty space. I headed for the men's room, splashing cold water on my face and letting it run down my neck. As I looked up at my reflection, haggard and pale in the mirror, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the mirror, reflected in the partially open door behind me, I caught a glimpse of movement. Just a shadow, really, but distinctly human-shaped. I whirled around, but the doorway was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and nervous even to my own ears. No response. Shaking it off as a trick of my tired mind, I left the restroom and headed for the vending machines. That's when I noticed the other oddities. A jacket draped over a chair, as if its owner had just stepped away. A smartphone on a table, its screen still lit up. And there, in the trash can by the door, that steaming cup of coffee. My skin prickled with goosebumps. Where was everyone? I stepped back outside, scanning the parking lot. The cars I'd seen earlier were still there, some with doors hanging open. I approached the nearest one, a blue sedan. The keys were in the ignition, the engine ticking as it cooled. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty lot. "Anyone here?" The silence that answered was deafening. That's when I saw the tire tracks, fresh ones, leading from one of the parking spots and stopping abruptly at the edge of the lot, as if the car had simply vanished into thin air. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline clearing the fog of exhaustion from my mind. Something was very, very wrong here. I turned, intending to run back to my truck and get the hell out of there. That's when I saw it. The figure at the edge of the woods. It was human-shaped, but somehow off. Too tall, too thin, its proportions not quite right. It stood perfectly still, half hidden behind a tree, watching me. I froze, caught in its gaze like a rabbit before a wolf. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, it raised a hand, beckoning. Terror jolted through me like an electric shock. I ran, sprinting back to my truck with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I fumbled with the keys, swearing as I dropped them, scrabbling in the gravel to retrieve them. As I pulled myself up into the cab, I risked a glance back. The figure was closer now, no longer hiding behind the trees. In the harsh glare of the rest stoplights, I could see it more clearly. And God, I wish I couldn't. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over an impossible frame. Its face was smooth, featureless except for deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a cat's, and its mouth. Its mouth split its face from ear to ear, filled with needle-sharp teeth. I got the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. As I slammed the truck into gear, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. More figures emerging from the woods, dozens of them, all with that same impossible physiology, all moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. I floored it, the truck's tires spinning in the gravel before finding purchase. I tore out of that rest stop like all the demons of hell were on my tail, and for all I know, they were. I drove for hours, pushing well past the legal limit for consecutive time behind the wheel. I didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky and I was 2 states away. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally worked up the courage to check my mirrors, the highway behind me was empty, no sign of pursuit, no hint of the horror I'd left behind. But the memory of those figures, of that beckoning hand, was burned into my mind. I considered reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I'd sound like a lunatic, raving about monsters at a rest stop. So I kept quiet, finished my run, and tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I couldn't forget, and I couldn't stop wondering about those people at the rest stop, the ones who'd left behind their cars, their belongings, the ones who'd followed that beckoning hand into the woods. Where had they gone? What had happened to them? In the weeks that followed, I did some digging. It wasn't easy. I'm no detective, and I had precious little to go on. But what I found chilled me to the bone. There were stories, whispered tales among long-haul truckers and late-night travelers, stories of rest stops where people vanished without a trace, of figures seen at the edge of the woods, always at night, always beckoning. Some called them aliens, others said they were interdimensional beings. A few spoke of ancient, forgotten gods, awakening in our modern world. I don't know what they are. I don't know what they want, but I know they're out there, waiting at the edges of lonely highways, in the shadows of late-night rest stops. I still drive, but never at night if I can help it. I avoid rest stops, pushing myself to make it from one major town to the next without breaks. And I never, ever stop if I see a solitary figure standing at the edge of the woods. Sometimes, on long hauls when the night is dark and the road seems to go on forever, I think I see them in my mirrors. Tall, thin figures, keeping pace with my truck despite its speed. Watching, waiting. And sometimes, I wonder if I really did escape that night, or if, somehow, I'm still there, trapped in some in-between place, living out a life that's not quite real. So if you're ever driving late at night and you see a rest stop appear out of the darkness, think twice before you stop. Check your gas gauge, your caffeine levels, your fatigue. Ask yourself, is it worth the risk? Because you never know what might be waiting there in the shadows. You never know who, or what, might be beckoning you into the woods, and once you follow, you might never find your way back. Remember my story, and keep driving, no matter how tired you are. Because some rest stops aren't meant for rest. Some are gateways to places we were never meant to go. And once you cross that threshold, there's no coming back.
For a little backstory, Daniel was my childhood best friend from my neighborhood, and he lived in the building next to mine in the year of 1993, if I remember correctly. But we all called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, his stepfather, and he moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by a mountain and woods on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas all around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because when they were getting there in his mom's car, he could see lots of places where he could play in and explore. So as a kid, that was a very exciting thing. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day and while the sun was up, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were really scary. He felt an ominous presence from those woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things, like the dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs, cats, spiders, sharks, you name it. Just like me, and this was because he was a total mama's boy. And at 5 years old, what do you expect? When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us, and talking to each other. We immediately bonded and became friends, because we had a lot of things in common. We started talking about our favorite TV shows and movies such as Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, the X-Men cartoons, and Ninja Turtles, among many others. So, we used to play by pretending we were superheroes or some sort of cartoon character while running around, using the merry-go-round, the slides, the swings, and funny enough, we both had plastic lightsabers. So we fought as if we were Jedis or Ninja Turtles, but we never stayed in the park once the sun went down either, because our sisters did not let us, or we were just too scared, honestly. However, Dan was not my only friend in the neighborhood. I introduced him to my other friends who lived in my building and other buildings and houses. Their names were the following: Eliza, Diego, JP, Mike, Laura, and Gerard. All of us were around the same age, and we all became great friends as the months went by, because almost every afternoon we played sports, played in the park, trick-or-treated, had water balloon fights, played Nintendo together, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day, and even did everything together. The neighborhood kids liked to joke around by saying that the woods behind the buildings were haunted. At that time, we played hide-and-seek or cops and robbers, so we ran around the street until 7 p.m., because that was our curfew, and we had to do our boring homework after that. But Dan and I went to bed late at night in secret, while we talked quietly on the phone. That night, it was like 9 or 10 p.m., I think. Dan asked me the following: "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude, of course. I would not miss it for the world. Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the Four Horsemen?" "Yeah, dude. That fight was awesome. I loved it. But talking about something else, have you heard some creepy noises behind your building at night?" "Nah, bro, I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out." "Wow, I wish I was that lucky. I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk sometimes. Well, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow. Take care, bro." "Sure thing, man. Talk to you tomorrow. Take care." Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down in bed, grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand, and started reading it until he began to close his eyes and doze off. He fell into a deep sleep, and was now dreaming, or so he thought. In his dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest, but was woken up by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath him, or as if some person or animal was walking in the woods. There are a lot of cats in the neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats potentially, maybe a possum or an owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him and said, "Daniel, it's Professor X. The X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange, but yet familiar voice was very similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside of his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots, took his glasses, got out of his apartment, and went to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little cold, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow, he felt extremely attracted to this voice, like metal to a magnet, because he could not get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He then felt very scared, but kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. While he was walking, he heard other footsteps and leaves crunching beside his. He felt like these steps were approaching his position. At that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly, since he thought it was some crazy person or an animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. There are a lot of cats in this neighborhood, like I said, so Dan thought it was one of those cats. Maybe it was some other sort of animal, but then he heard a noise that sounded like a roar. He thought it sounded very similar to those dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. He had recently seen that movie in theaters, so it was the closest thing he could think of. Suddenly, he heard fast steps from somebody or something running in his direction. Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out, and fortunately, when he hit the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder. So, he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him, circled his location, and then it smelled the air in order to get a scent, but he guessed it decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours because he was woken up by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree. The heat and glare from the sun in his face woke him up. He rubbed his eyes, opened them, and looked all around him. He was in shock and horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw that it was 6 a.m. He had woken up in the middle of the forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because he was dreaming, but he had sleepwalked into the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushed the leaves from his arms and legs, and ran away from that creepy forest, which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got into his parking lot. He ran to his building's door, opened it, ran to the elevator, and he saw himself in the mirror and could not believe that happened to him. Dan got to his apartment door, opened the door silently, tiptoed inside the apartment's hallway, and saw that thankfully his mother and father had not waken up yet. So, he went to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what occurred last night. He completely believed his parents when they told him not to listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. So, Dan had many questions and thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know he would listen to it? How did it know he loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out, or maybe he would. Who knows?
I still think about Liz, sometimes every day. She loved gardening, and her yard always looked neat, and I would wave to her on Saturday mornings when she was working on her flowers, and she was always smiling. This happened on January 25th, 2019, and that Friday morning was very cold for Houston. I was making coffee when I heard 4 loud pops. I thought it was fireworks at first, but something felt wrong. I looked out the window and saw someone running away from Liz's driveway and getting into a truck, and then the truck sped off. I went outside with my phone ready to call 911, and Liz was there lying on the ground near her driveway, and she wasn't moving. There was a small table and some boxes nearby from the garage sale that she was setting up. Neighbors started coming out of their homes looking confused and worried. The paramedics came quickly and worked on Liz, but it was clear that things were very bad. Later, I found out that she had passed away at the hospital. She was only 29 years old, and I never thought something so awful could happen in our neighborhood. The police said Liz had been shot at close range by someone who walked up to her. A neighbor's security camera caught part of it, and the video showed a person getting out of a black Nissan Frontier, walking up to Liz, shooting her, and driving away, and it all happened in seconds. Liz and her husband, Sergio, were loved by everyone. They were high school sweethearts and had been married for about 4 years. They loved Star Wars and Harry Potter and went to conventions together. And the garage sale Liz was having that morning was to help pay for a trip to Universal Studios to celebrate their 5th anniversary. And knowing this made her death even sadder. After Liz died, the neighborhood changed drastically. People were sad and scared, and we kept wondering who could have done this. Was it someone she knew? Was it random? The police talked to neighbors and looked at security videos, but they didn't find any answers. They released the video of the suspect in the truck, hoping someone would recognize them, and nobody did. I kept thinking about that morning. Could I have done something to help? Could I have seen more, remembered a license plate? And that guilt stuck with me. I would sit and stare at Liz's house, hoping to see her again, even though I knew that I wouldn't. The empty driveway was a painful reminder of what had happened. and Sergio moved out a few months later, totally understandable. It must have been too hard for him to stay in the house with all of those memories. That house was sold and new people moved in. They're nice, but to me it will always be Liz's home. And years have passed, but the case is still unsolved. Sometimes the news will run a story about Liz, hoping to keep her memory alive, and the reward for information has grown, but no one has come forward. And it makes me so angry to know the person who did this is still free out there. I joined a local group that helps with unsolved cases. We hold events, hand out flyers, and try to keep cases like Liz's in the public eye. It's not much, but it feels like I'm doing something. Liz and her family deserve justice. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I leave yellow roses at her driveway, as yellow was her favorite color. Other neighbors do the same, and it's a quiet way to show that we haven't forgotten her. Sometimes at night, I look out my window and wonder if the answer is closer than we think. Did someone see something that they're too scared to tell? Could the killer be nearby? Not knowing has become very hard. Liz's death taught me that life is fragile, that bad things don't always make sense. But it also showed me how people can come together during very tough times. Our neighborhood has changed, and we're more careful to look out for each other even more now. We value small moments like that. I miss Liz. I miss her smile and kindness, and I carry her memory with me and will keep trying to get justice for her. Someone has to. She deserves it.
Here's a story that occurred to me about 4 years ago. It was an abnormally cold day. Sure, it can get cold in the late parts of the year, but usually in Louisiana, it doesn't get that cold. Maybe around the high 50s, maybe 60s, but on that day, it was in the low 20s. The carbon dioxide was like a cigarette smoke that came from my mouth as I sighed. I had 2 layers of coats on, very heavy coats, plus a bunch of other stuff to keep me warm. It was a long day at school, and I was ready to get out of there. The school is surrounded by somewhat dense forest. I always look in the tree line as I walk home from school, because I just feel like I'm not alone and I'm being watched. As school ended, I eagerly barged out of the gate and started walking home. My house is a good 30, maybe 40 minutes away. I walked down the same path through the woods as I always did, when suddenly I heard a scream, or more like a screech, that echoed in the forest. It has probably been 20 minutes since I began my walk through the woods, and it's already getting dark. I then begin to smell the stench of something rotten. That is when I almost trip on something. I looked down and almost puked. There, in front of me, were the horrifically mangled remains of a man who had gone missing a few days prior. I froze and moved only my eyes spastically left to right. Nothing. Suddenly, the same screech echoed in the woods, but this time closer than before. I froze again. Then I heard the spine-chilling crunch of leaves and sticks not too far away from where I was. Then, from out of nowhere, the temperature suddenly spiked. It went from freezing to what felt like summer weather, meaning that it gets to almost 110 degrees out of nowhere. By now, I was scared out of my mind. I started fast walking when something felt like it was watching me. I swerved around, and with the dying light, I saw it. It was fast. So fast that I only caught the sheer size of whatever it was. It was at least 8 feet tall. I screamed unintentionally and ran. Then, I tripped on the roots of a tree that were probably 3/4 of the way through the forest, which ended up absolutely murdering my right leg. Then, I saw those eyes. It was pitch black and the temperature was so dang hot. But I know what I was looking at. It was a set of eyes, at least 15 feet away, just staring at me. They were glowing yellow with jet black viper pupils. I slowly reached in my back pocket, not leaving the vision of those eyes. My fingers met my phone, and I pulled it out gingerly. I turned the flashlight on, and I still have nightmares about it to this day. In the few seconds I had, I screamed the absolute crap out of my lungs at that sight. The beast was dark crimson in color, almost like blood. Its sternum protruded from its chest with a point. It had long, black hair with 2 curved crimson horns. It had 2 pairs of blood-red wings. The upper ones were massive while the lower ones were shorter and thinner. A long crimson tail flicked in the air as well. Instead of fingers, it had what I can describe more like clawed talons. But what the most horrifying thing about this creature was its unholy grin. That darn grin was stretching to its ears and its teeth were huge. These teeth, if I had to guess, were at least a foot long or so. They were like kitchen knives. Before I could even take a picture, it ran off with such speed that it pulled air away. I started limping away, not noticing that the bone in my leg was literally protruding through my skin. Then I fell, looked up, and there it was. It grabbed me and hoisted me in the air. It had me face to face. It snorted in my face. It reeked of decay. It was the most disgusting thing I think I've ever smelled in my life. I was 13 at the time, and I was a major wuss, some would say. I cried. I sobbed, and my face went to tears. It is at that point the creature, maybe feeling sympathetic, cocked its head and put a finger to my mouth. It was burning hot and felt like stone. Then, everything went black. When I came to, I was at my front door, confused. I looked around and saw very clearly the same glowing eyes at me from bushes in the garden. But as soon as I saw them, they vanished. I then looked down at my leg to see that it was back to normal. But I turned my leg over to see something, or someone carved a huge symbol into my knee. I don't know what it was I saw, but I started writing short stories about it ever since.
I had decided to go to some yard sales in the neighborhood, and I wasn't looking for anything specific, just seeing if there was anything interesting. After visiting a few, I was about to go home when I saw an old metal box under a table at one of the sales. I asked the lady in charge of the sale how much she wanted for the box, and she said the box belonged to her uncle, and she had no idea what was inside. Then, after thinking for a moment, she said that she wanted $5 for it. I gave her the money and carried the box to my car. As I held it, I thought that I felt a slight vibration or sort of hum, but I wasn't sure. I figured it was just my imagination and then drove home, eager to see what was inside. When I opened the box in my kitchen, I saw a small metal ball. It was warm when I touched it. The air felt heavy around it, too, and it had a symbol on it that I didn't recognize. Below the ball were some old papers. They were yellowed and had strange equations and diagrams on them. Since I didn't understand any of them, I thought that it might be a good idea to ask someone online about it. I took a picture of the glowing ball and posted it on a forum asking if anyone knew what it was, and I got a lot of replies. Most people joked about it being from aliens or a movie prop, but one comment stood out to me. It said, "Get rid of it. It's radioactive." I felt my stomach drop. I moved away from the box, feeling nervous, and I didn't know what to do next. Should I call someone? But who? Then I got a private message in my inbox. It was from someone who said that they worked in nuclear safety, and the message said, "Don't touch it anymore. Move it to a safe place and let me help you." And I followed their instructions to the letter. I took the box to my garage and put it inside a plastic container, and I stayed as far away from it as I could while moving it. The person messaged me again asking for more details, and they wanted to know the size of the ball, its color, and about the papers. And they explained that warm metal objects can sometimes be radioactive, especially if they're old lab samples or industrial materials, and the person then told me to call the authorities. I was scared, but knew that they were right, and I called the police. They transferred me to a state agency that handles dangerous materials, and about an hour later, a team arrived at my house wearing protective suits and carrying special equipment. The team scanned the ball with a device that made clicking noises, and the clicks got faster the closer they got to the ball. They told me it was radioactive. One of them said that I was lucky that I hadn't kept it in the house for long because it could have possibly made me very sick. And they carefully packed the ball and the papers into a special container that was lined with lead, and then took it away. Later, I found out the police questioned the woman who sold me the box. She said that she had no idea her uncle had anything dangerous. She explained that he had been a chemist many years ago. The radioactive ball was probably something that he had worked on and forgotten about. And the authorities told me that they would investigate further, but I never heard anything else about it. Now, for weeks after this happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That glowing ball could have caused serious harm, and at first it seemed like a fun mystery, but it turned out to be very dangerous. I thought about how close I had come to putting myself and others at risk just because I was curious. And I haven't gone to any yard sales since that day. The whole experience has made me very nervous about bringing unknown things into my home. And now, whenever I see an interesting object for sale, I think twice.
This story takes place in the boonies of Allenson, Michigan, about 2 years ago. I was over at my best friend Marcus's house. His house, for reference, is like a large barn-like structure with a basement. It was about the second week into the summer, and we were up for a snack run, like we normally do when it gets late, and we don't like to wake his grandparents. I don't get scared very easy, and I've always had unnaturally great hearing. So, I could tell when someone was moving around even in the dark with my eyes closed, and know where they were, and a rough idea of how tall they were, and how far they would be. I was pretty great for hide and seek. My friend Marcus and our other friends soon began to realize that I was pretty hard to play against. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. We were wide awake and bored. We decided to start a small campfire in the backyard next to their camper. About 300 yards away from the house and surrounding Marcus's grandparents' house is nothing but woods. We sit down and talk for a while, and then our friend Jay wanted to go into the camper for a while because he gets cold easy, and there are blankets in there. We decided that we would go in with him because he didn't want to be left alone. I was watching the fire because it always calms me down. I decided to stay out by the fire for a little longer. I started to realize that there were no crickets or bullfrogs making any noise, so I glanced around with my back to the camper, and I didn't see anything. At least, not at first. So, I didn't think anything of it. I start hearing more footsteps, though, coming from the edge of the woods. I looked up to see this dog-like creature on the edge of the woods, just behind the tree line. Its head was easily 5 to 6 feet from the ground, with yellowish-green eyes that seemed to glow. I didn't think anything of it, because animals are curious, just like we humans are. But I kept an eye on it. But not 3 minutes later, Marcus comes out of the camper and locked eyes with something to the left. There were 2 shadowy-like figures walking back and forth in the field, getting closer and closer. He sits down beside me while watching the figures and asked me if I saw them too. I told him I did and described exactly what I was seeing. I told him it felt like they were about 200 feet away and low to the ground. I pointed out the creature I was staring down in the tree line as well, and told him to keep an eye out if they got closer, and if they did, go inside the camper and not to come out unless I said otherwise. But thankfully, it didn't come to that. Morning broke and we were all pretty tired, but then I checked later in the day where the creature stood to see if there were any footprints or anything. I did notice that the grass was matted down, but I didn't notice any distinct footmarks. I didn't tell Marcus or Jay that, because I wanted to keep them out of that stuff, and because once you've had an encounter with one, you're bound to have another one or so. Thank you for sharing my story. I'd appreciate it a lot if I could get any sort of ideas of what it may be. I've been watching your channel for a few years now, and I love the encounters everyone has shared. I think what I saw that night might be a dogman, but I'm not sure.
There was a woman in my neighborhood running a yard sale. She was selling some old furniture, clothes, and knickknacks. A few neighbors had stopped by to look around. Her small dog was tied up to a post nearby. That small dog was barking every so often. Down the street there was a larger dog that lived with his owner, and he was a big dog, a mix of some kind, and his owner usually kept him in the backyard or on a leash when they went for walks. But this morning, Something went wrong. The gate to the big dog owner's backyard had been left open, and that big dog saw his chance and ran out into the street. At first, that big dog was just exploring. He sniffed around and ran back and forth, and then he noticed the people and the tables up ahead. His tail wagged as he ran toward the closest yard sale, but as he got closer, his energy shifted, and his bark grew louder and more aggressive. His eyes locked on the crowd, and he charged forward. People saw the big dog coming and started to back away, and a little boy dropped the toy that he was holding and screamed as he ran to his mom, but the big dog didn't stop. He jumped onto a table, knocking over a stack of books and smashing a bunch of glass. The lady looked up and shouted, "Get away," but that dog didn't listen. He grabbed a stuffed animal from the table and started tearing it apart. Then the big dog turned his attention to the little dog, and the little dog was barking. The big dog barked back, and then it attacked. The lady screamed and grabbed the little dog just in time, and the big one circled her. She began yelling for help, and the crowd began to scatter. A man who had been browsing a table nearby tried to intervene, yelling and stepping in front of the lady and her dog, and that big dog then attacked the man. The dog sunk his teeth into the man's leg. He yells out in pain and tried to push the dog away, but the dog wouldn't let go. The man fell to the ground trying to kick the big dog, but the dog's strength was too much. People were screaming. One man threw a folding chair at that dog and did nothing. The dog let go of the man's leg and jumped on its chest. The man used his arms to shield his face, and the dog scratched him as he yelled for help. That dog's owner came running down the street, shouting at the dog to stop, and it did, and its owner then clipped the leash onto its collar. That bigger dog's owner said that he was sorry. Someone at that point had already called the cops, and someone else began to yell at that dog owner. Paramedics arrived and began treating the man's injuries before loading him into an ambulance, and neighbors stood around talking to one another. The dog's owner apologized again. The yard was a mess with broken glass and scattered items everywhere. Some people helped the lady clean up, and the street was quiet again. All I know, as a bystander who just sat and watched everything unfold, is that myself nor anyone in the neighborhood will ever forget that day.